Clearwater Falls, Alberta, autumn of 1923. The morning Iris Hadley was handed over like a debt being settled. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind smelled of frozen mud and comfing snow. She stood in the yard of her father's property. If you could call the listing shack and its 2 rotted fence posts a property, with a wool coat too thin for the cold and a carpet bag that held everything she'd managed to keep, which wasn't much. Her father, Douglas Hadley, stood on the porch with his arms crossed and his chin pointed at the road. He didn't look at her. He hadn't looked at her properly in 2 years. Not since her husband Clarence had sent her home without ceremony or explanation. Just a wagon to the door, her things already packed, and a note that said she was being returned. Like a tool that hadn't done its job. Barren, her father told the neighbors. Married 2 years and not a sign of a child. Clarence Pell had a family name to carry forward. He needed sons. She'd given him nothing. So Douglas Hadley had spent the last 8 months telling anyone in Clearwater Falls who would listen that his daughter was more trouble than she was worth. Until the word spread the way bad news always does in small towns. Fast and without mercy. She hadn't pleaded. She'd tried that with Clarence. On the morning he told her what was happening, and it had only made him look at the ceiling. She'd tried it with her father when she arrived home, bag in hand, shame walking beside her like a second shadow. Neither time had it changed a thing. So she stopped. She stood in that yard, with her jaw set and her hands still, and she watched her father gesture toward the road without speaking, the way you'd point a dog away from the kitchen. The wagon came from the north end of town. It was plain and unhurried, pulled by a gray mare with a patient stride. The man holding the reins didn't look like someone coming to collect anything. He looked like someone who'd been driving a long time and had made peace with it. He pulled the mare to a stop at the fence. He was perhaps 40, broad across the shoulder, with a face that the weather had shaped into something still and deliberate. He wore a canvas coat that had seen real work in it, and his hat was pushed back enough that she could see his eyes. Gray, steady, not unkind. He stepped down from the wagon without hurry. Her father came off the porch. "There's the situation," he said, as if she were a transaction being explained to a buyer. "She's able-bodied, good with a needle. She'll do what's told." He paused. There's a reason she came back. You know what it is." The man didn't answer that. He looked at Iris for the first time, not the way she'd been looked at in Clearwater Falls for the past year. The sideways glance, the quick reassessment downward, but directly, like he was trying to understand something that had been poorly explained. Then he reached into his coat, produced an envelope, and set it on the fence post. Her father picked it up. The man didn't watch him count it. He looked instead at the yard, at the cracked water trough and the door hanging wrong on its hinge, and then back at the road. "She won't be talked about anymore," he said. "Not by you or anyone else in this town." Her father started to say something. The man had already turned toward the wagon. Iris picked up her bag. No one told her to. She simply understood that staying was no longer an option, and that the road ahead of her, however strange, was the only one available. She climbed up into the wagon. The seat was cold. The wind found the gap between her collar and her hair. The man clicked his tongue at the mare and they rolled north. She didn't know his name was Grant Calloway yet. He didn't offer it for nearly a mile. When he did, it came out flat and simple, like a fact about the weather. "Grant Calloway. My place is about 2 hours out." He handed her a tin of tea wrapped in cloth that had kept some warmth in it. She drank without speaking. The road north out of Clearwater Falls opened into country that went wide and pale to the horizon. Birch stands stood stripped for autumn, their white trunks thin against the gray sky. The grass along the ditch was the color of straw. A hawk turned slow circles above a field that had already gone to frost. Nothing moved unless the wind moved it. He didn't speak again, and she didn't ask him to. She studied his profile when he wasn't looking. The jaw that hadn't relaxed. The way he held the reins without gripping. Just resting, like someone who'd learned that tension doesn't make a horse go better. "Why did you do it?" she asked finally. She meant the money, the envelope, the whole strange arrangement. She didn't know exactly what to call it. He kept his eyes on the road. "I've got 4 children," he said. "Lost their mother to pneumonia 3 winters back. The youngest is 6. The oldest is 14 and running out of patience for all of it." She waited. "I needed someone steady," he said. "Not someone cruel. Everything else I can manage." She didn't answer. But something in her chest, something that had been held very tight and very still for a long time, moved slightly. Not open, just shifted. The farm came into view near dusk. It was set back from the road in a stand of spruce, the house square and plain, its paint worn to bare wood in places. A barn stood to the left, solid and well kept in a way the house wasn't. Smoke came from the chimney. A dog barked twice and then went quiet. Grant tied off the mare and walked to the house without holding the door for her. Not out of rudeness, she understood, but because the assumption was that she'd follow. She did. Inside, 4 children looked up. A boy of about 14 with his father's same deliberate face. Twin girls, maybe 10, who looked like they'd been waiting for something for a long time and hadn't decided yet if this was it. And a small boy of 6 with a gap in his front teeth and boots on the wrong feet, who stared at her with no suspicion at all. Just open, flat curiosity. Their mother was Eleanor, Grant said. She's been gone 3 years now. The oldest boy, he introduced himself as Lorne, gave her a single nod and looked away. The twins watched her with careful eyes. The youngest walked straight up to her and said, "Can you make porridge that isn't lumpy?" She almost smiled. "That depends," she said on the pot. He appeared to consider this seriously, and then returned to the corner, where he'd left a wooden horse on the floor. Grant showed her the room at the top of the stairs. Small, north-facing, with a washstand and a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the east field. He said, "There's extra blankets in the chest. The stove will warm the floor by morning if you bank it right." Then he left her to it. She set her bag on the bed and sat beside it. The sounds of the house came up through the floor. The low argument of the twins, the scrape of a chair, Grant's voice saying something short and final that stopped whatever it was. She pressed her hands flat on her knees and didn't cry. She'd made a decision somewhere on that cold wagon ride that she wasn't going to spend her first night in a new place undoing herself. There would be time for that later or not at all. She listened to the house until it went quiet, and then she slept. Morning came early. The kitchen was cold, and someone had already put a fire on. Grant, she found out later, was up before anyone else by habit. She came downstairs to find the stove lit and a kettle going but the porridge untouched, because none of them had quite worked out the trick of it without burning the bottom. She moved carefully. She didn't yet know who took their tea strong, who was frightened of the dark, who needed a second reminder before they put on their boots. She learned it the slow way, by watching, by being wrong, by trying again. The first weeks were difficult in ways she hadn't expected. Not unkindness exactly, but a kind of held-breath distance that the children maintained. Lorne was the most guarded. He'd been the one managing the younger ones since his mother died, and he wore that responsibility like something too heavy that had been set on his shoulders by accident, and he'd simply never put it down. He watched Iris with a measuring look that reminded her of a man deciding whether a beam would hold weight. The twins, Hazel and June, were quieter about it. They'd whisper to each other when she entered a room. Not meanly, but as though they were trying to work something out. They didn't yet know what to make of her presence, so they filed it away and watched. Only the youngest, whose name was Thomas, though everyone called him Tom, treated her as if she'd always been there. He brought her things. A stone that he said was shaped like a bear. A drawing he'd done of the horse on brown paper. One afternoon he handed her a broken comb and said, "You can fix things, right?" She fixed it. It took the better part of an hour and a piece of wire she found in the barn. He received it with great ceremony. She tried to earn her place quietly. She had never been a skilled cook, but she was stubborn about it. And she read the old recipe book, she found in the pantry the way other people read law. Slowly, literally, twice. The bread came out dense the first time and better the second. The soup was thin for 2 weeks and then suddenly right. She learned the wood stove's temper, which side burned hot and which needed coaxing. One evening, 3 weeks in, she was carrying a pot of soup from the stove to the table and her grip went wrong. The pot came down hard on the floor, soup spreading across the boards in a slow, dark tide. She stood still. Her whole body went rigid with the waiting. For the shout, for the tone she knew, the one that said, "You've failed again. You can't even manage this." Grant came through the back door with firewood in his arms. He looked at the floor, then at her. He set the wood down. He got the mop from behind the door without a word and handed it to her. Then he crouched down and picked up the pot. "Wasn't much left in there anyway," he said. She stood with the mop and didn't move for a moment. Something in the back of her throat ached. Not with shame this time, with something she couldn't name yet. Something that had to do with being given room to fail without paying for it afterward. The nights were long that autumn. After the children were in bed, she sat on the porch when the cold allowed it, and when it didn't, at the kitchen table, with whatever mending needed doing. Grant sometimes sat at the other end of the table and worked on whatever piece of harness or woodwork he'd brought in. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them was not the silence of strangers. It was closer to the silence of people who understood that words were not always the main point. The first real thing that broke the careful distance happened in late October. Tom woke at 2 in the morning with a cough that rattled deep in his chest and a fever that made his skin feel like a heated stone. Iris heard him before Grant did. Her sleep in that house had always been light, and she was at his bedside before he'd finished calling out. She pressed her hand to his forehead. Too warm. She went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and found the tin of dried elderflower in the pantry. She made a tea and steeped it dark, then added a spoon of honey from the crock on the shelf. She came back and sat beside Tom, lifting him slightly so he could drink, speaking low and even while he shivered. Grant appeared in the doorway. He'd pulled his coat on over his nightclothes, and his hair was uncombed. "Do you have eucalyptus?" she said. "Or camphor?" He went to the barn and came back with both. She made a steam and held the bowl close to Tom's face, a cloth over his head to keep it in. She sat with him that way for over an hour, until his breathing had eased and his temperature had come down to something bearable. She didn't sleep again that night. She stayed in the chair beside the bed, dozing in half-hour intervals, waking each time he shifted. By morning, Tom opened his eyes and looked at her with the serious expression he sometimes wore that made him look much older than 6, and said, "I'm hungry." She laughed, quietly, so as not to wake the others. "I'll make porridge," she said, "the kind without lumps." She was downstairs at the stove when she heard Grant's footstep on the stairs. He paused at the kitchen doorway. She didn't turn around. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Thank you." She kept stirring. She didn't trust her voice just then, so she only nodded. That morning after breakfast, she found a piece of paper folded on the counter beside the kettle. 2 words in handwriting that was careful and slightly stiff, like a man who'd learned his letters late and never entirely lost the effort of them. "Good people stay. No name." She read it twice, then folded it along its crease and slipped it into her coat pocket. She kept it there all winter. In November, Grant had an errand that took him into Clearwater Falls, and he said, without particular ceremony, "Come if you want." She considered the town, the looks, the particular quality of silence that fell when she walked past the dry goods store, and she went anyway. There was nothing to be gained by hiding. She waited by the wagon while Grant went into the hardware store. That was when she heard the voice from across the street, carrying over the cold air with the particular clarity that small-town contempt always seemed to achieve. "Well, there she is. Returned goods, out for an airing." She turned. Vera Pell, Clarence's aunt. A woman who had never liked her, even when the marriage was still standing, stood in front of the post office with another woman Iris didn't know. Vera's chin was up, her voice at the volume that wasn't quite shouting but was perfectly audible on a quiet street. "Couldn't give the family a single child in 2 years," Vera said to her companion, loud enough for the two men coming out of the barber shop to hear. "Now she's out here playing housekeeper for some widower up north. Practical, I suppose. When you can't do what a woman's meant to do, you find something lower to land on." The other woman laughed, a short, careful sound that meant she wasn't entirely sure about it, but was unwilling to disagree. Iris stood with her hands at her sides. Then Grant came out of the hardware store. He had a sack under one arm and his hat was pulled low against the wind. He stopped when he saw Iris's face, then followed her line of sight to the two women across the street. He set the sack in the wagon, walked back to stand beside her. He looked at Vera Pell with the calm, level expression of a man who has considered and discarded several options and arrived at the simplest one. "She spent 3 nights tending my youngest through a fever that would have laid a grown man low," he said. His voice was not loud, but the street was quiet enough that it carried. "She has more steadiness and sense than most people I've known. So I'd ask you to consider carefully what you say about her." Vera Pell's mouth opened and then closed. Grant turned to Iris. "Ready?" She nodded. She didn't speak until they were well out of town, the road quiet around them and the birches gone gray and skeletal in the late afternoon light. Then she said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know it," he said. They drove the rest of the way in silence. But it was a different kind of silence than it had been before. The winter that year was mean and long. January came in with temperatures that dropped the mercury below anything the thermometer was designed to measure, and stayed there. The pipes froze twice. The barn roof held, barely. The well needed clearing every morning before it could be used. Grant worked the farm with the same deliberate efficiency he brought to everything. Iris worked beside him more than he'd expected. She didn't ask to, she said. She simply showed up when there was something that needed more than one pair of hands. Holding the light while he fixed the pump, passing tools over the fence when he worked on the fence line, carrying water when the pail was too heavy for the younger ones. One afternoon in February, she came in from the yard to find Lorne sitting at the kitchen table with his arithmetic laid out in front of him and a look on his face that meant he'd been sitting there too long and the numbers had stopped making sense. She sat down across from him without asking. He stiffened slightly, the way he always did when someone entered his space without being invited. She looked at the page. She turned it toward her, then back. "You're trying to do the whole thing in your head," she said. "That's the problem. Write down what you know and let the rest of it follow." He said nothing, but he picked up his pencil. They sat there for an hour. She didn't solve things for him. She just waited while he worked, and pointed when he missed a step, and didn't react when he snapped at her once because he was frustrated. She let it pass like weather. When he finished the last problem, he sat back and stared at the page for a moment. "My mother used to do arithmetic with me," he said. It was the first time he'd mentioned her to Iris directly. She was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like she was patient," Iris said. He shrugged. "She had to be. I'm not easy." "No," Iris agreed. "But you're not as difficult as you think either." He looked at her sharply, as if deciding whether to be offended. Then something in his face shifted slightly, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, and he looked back down at his arithmetic. He didn't say anything else, but the next evening, he set his school book at the end of the table, nearest her without being asked, and she understood that something had been decided. Spring was late that year, and when it came it was grudging. Ice, leaving the field slowly, the creek behind the barn running high and cold and brown with snowmelt. Iris started a kitchen garden in a plot that had gone to weeds the last 2 seasons. She turned the soil herself, working it in the evenings after supper when the light held long enough. The twins began appearing beside her after the first week, not quite asking to help, but showing up and staying. She gave them sections and let them manage them the way they wanted to. which meant Hazel planted everything in precise rows, and June planted hers in a pattern that made no agricultural sense whatsoever, but that June was certain about. It was during this time that a moment happened that Iris didn't plan for and wasn't ready for. She was braiding June's hair one evening by the stove. June had declared that her braid was always wrong and she wanted it done differently. And Hazel was at the table reading, and Tom was asleep on the rug with his cheek on his folded arm, and Lorne was somewhere upstairs, and the house had the soft, thick feeling it sometimes had in the evening, when everything was accounted for. And nothing needed immediate attention. June said, out of nowhere, the way children say things when they've been thinking for a long time, and the thought has finally reached its capacity. "Can we just call you Mum?" The room didn't go still, exactly. Hazel looked up from her book. Iris's hands paused in June's hair just for a moment. She started the braid again. "If that's what you'd like," she said. June considered this. "Yeah," she said. "I think it would be easier." Hazel said nothing, but she put her book down and watched Iris with an expression that had no calculation in it anymore. Just something clear and quiet. The next morning, Lorne said it. He came downstairs and found her at the stove and said, "Mum, do we have any more of that bread from yesterday?" Just like that, the way you say something when it's already true. She didn't turn around immediately. She counted to 3. "There's half a loaf in the cloth on the shelf," she said. And that was that. Grant watched all of it from the doorframe one evening and didn't say a word. But she caught him looking, later, when she was setting the table and he thought she wasn't watching. A long, measuring look that had something in it she hadn't seen directed at her in a long time. It was May when the trouble came from the direction she hadn't expected. A man named Victor Keel, a trapper who lived on the ridge east of the property line and had a reputation for being difficult when he was drinking, which was most of the time, showed up at the well one night when Iris was drawing water. The children were inside. Grant was in the far field. She heard him before she saw him. The unsteady footstep, the particular sound of a man who'd had too much and was looking for something to take it out on. He said things she wasn't going to repeat. He used words that she'd heard before, words that were designed to make a woman feel like the smallest possible version of herself. He was not subtle about his intentions. When he reached for her arm, she pulled back hard enough that the bucket swung and hit him in the shoulder, not enough to stop him, but enough to buy a step. Then the barn door opened and Grant came across the yard at a pace she hadn't seen from him before. What came next was brief and decisive. Victor Keel sat down in the mud beside the well and stayed there, holding his jaw. Grant stood over him with a look that was not anger. It was colder than anger, and steadier. "Get off my property," Grant said, "and don't come back to this land or anywhere near my family." Victor Keel got up without speaking and left. Grant turned to her. He looked her over with the kind of practicality that meant he was checking that nothing was hurt before he let himself feel anything else. "Are you all right?" She was shaking slightly, but she nodded. He crossed the distance between them and, without any awkwardness or ceremony, put his hand on her shoulder, just briefly. Then he stepped back and picked up the bucket she'd dropped. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I'd have managed." "I know you would have," he said, "but you shouldn't have to." She stood there in the yard with the night air cold around her, and something tight and long-held beginning, very slowly, to loosen. Later, inside, after the children were settled and the house was quiet, she cleaned the scrape on his knuckles where they'd connected with something solid. The kitchen smelled of soap and the remnant of supper. "You shouldn't get hurt on my account," she said. He looked at her steadily. "You're not an account." He said it plainly, without decoration. She pressed the cloth to his hand and kept her eyes on her work. "When I came here," she said quietly, "I thought I knew exactly what this was, what I was." He waited. "I was wrong," she said. The summer of 1924 was dry in Alberta the way summer sometimes is. Not a disaster, but a reminder of how thin the margin is between enough and not enough. The creek dropped to half its width. The kitchen garden tightened. Grant stopped sleeping well. He came in some evenings with dust in the lines of his face and a quiet that was heavier than his usual quiet. Iris got up earlier. She hauled water from the deep well before the children woke. She stretched what was in the pantry further than it should have gone. She was not going to let the garden fail. She was also not going to let Grant fold under it alone. One evening she came out to the far fence, where he was sitting on an upturned crate with his elbows on his knees and his hat pushed back, staring at the field. She sat down beside him without speaking and handed him a cup of tea. He took it, she said. After a while, the beans are still going. The potatoes will be enough. We'll be all right. He didn't answer right away. Then, I'm not sure I have much left to offer. She looked at him. She understood he didn't just mean the harvest. You have the children, she said. You have the land. You have a house that still holds. He turned the cup in his hands. And you have whatever this is, she said. She didn't elaborate. He understood. He looked at her then. A direct, open look that had nothing in it that was defensive or measured. Just tired and honest, and something else that she didn't try to name out loud. She reached across and covered his hand with hers. She left it there. He didn't speak for a long time. Then, I never thought I'd say this to anyone again. You don't have to say it, she said. I know. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat at the fence until the light was gone and the stars came out over the field, still and cold and permanent above the dry grass. Inside, a lamp burned in the kitchen window. One of the twins had forgotten to close the back door, and the dog had come in and was sleeping on the kitchen floor. A month later, in the spare September light, they were married at the church in Clearwater Falls. No announcement had been made. They simply went, with the 4 children and a minister who knew Grant from years back, and shook his hand warmly at the door. June wore a ribbon in her hair and declared afterward that the whole thing had been very satisfactory. Victor Keel was not present. He had, by that point, moved his trapping operation to a different ridge. The years moved through the farm the way seasons do, not always gently, but honestly. Lorne grew into a man with his father's shoulders and his mother Eleanor's laugh, which none of them had realized until it came out of him one evening over supper, and the whole table went still for a beat, surprised by it, and then, slowly, smiled. He left at 19 to work on a survey crew up north, and came back at 22 with a woman named Ingrid and a plan for his own land. He still called Iris Mum, but now also sometimes came to her for advice, the way a person comes to someone they've decided to trust. The twins grew into their own distinct shapes. Hazel became meticulous and competent, a person of great practicality who ran her own household like a well-kept clock. June remained convinced that planting things in non-standard arrangements produced better results, and she was never entirely wrong. They both came home often and brought children and filled the kitchen with noise that Iris had not known to miss until it was there. Tom stayed the longest. He was the one who helped Grant on the land as he got older, who learned which fence posts needed replacing before the winter, and which way the creek ran when the snow melted. He was the one, in the end, who sat beside Grant on the porch when the walking became difficult and the mornings came harder. The garden that Iris had started in that first spring grew year after year, until it had overtaken the original plot and spread along the south side of the barn. Vegetables gave way to flowers in the corners. Wild things crept in from the fence line and were allowed to stay. It was not a tidy garden. It was the kind of garden that looked like it had made its own decisions. Grant used to say he never interrupted her in it. He just watched from the porch with his coffee, hat pushed back, and let her do whatever she was doing. He said once that watching Iris move through a garden was like watching someone who had finally found the place where all their separate pieces fit. She told him that was sentimental, which it was. He agreed, which was unlike him. She smiled, which was not. The winter she died, the ground was frozen and the snow had come early. She went quietly, at home, in the bed she'd slept in for 32 years, with Grant on one side and Tom in the chair by the window. The others came as fast as the roads allowed. June arrived with flour on her coat because she'd been baking. When the call came and hadn't stopped to change, they buried her in the churchyard in Clearwater Falls, in the frozen ground at the edge of the lot where the spruce trees came close. Grant had the stone carved himself. He was very specific about what it said. She was returned once, as though she had no value. She chose to stay anyway. The rest of us were the better for it. After that, Grant walked to the churchyard on clear mornings when the cold wasn't too hard on his joints. He'd bring coffee in a thermos and sit on the bench they'd placed near the stone. He didn't say much. He'd never been a man who needed to fill silence to prove it was occupied. He died the following March, quietly in his sleep, and they placed him beside her as he'd said he wanted. The farm passed to Tom, who kept it going in the same plain, deliberate way his father always had. The garden came back every spring, wilder each year, spilling out of whatever boundaries anyone tried to set for it. Beans ran up the porch rail. Sunflowers grew above the fence line. Mint spread into the path, and nobody ever pulled it entirely because it smelled good when you walked through. Ingrid, Lorne's wife, once said that the garden didn't behave like a garden someone had planted. It behaved like something that had decided to stay. Tom said that sounded about right. Lorne's children and June's children and Hazel's children grew up knowing the story, the way families know things that are told and retold until they become part of the shape of the name. They knew about the wagon and the cold morning in Clearwater Falls. They knew about the fever and the eucalyptus and the lumpy porridge. They knew about the sign Grant had put on the fence post near the road, after the railroad sent men out with a survey and maps and a very reasonable offer for the eastern quarter. Grant had listened to the whole presentation and then said, no. The men had tried again. He'd said it again and shown them the road. The sign had been Iris's idea. She'd painted it herself on a square of board with paint left over from the barn, in letters that were not perfectly even but were entirely legible. Not for sale, not for moving, not for forgetting. It stood at the fence line for 30 years. When the wood finally rotted through, Tom replaced it with a new board and painted the same words in the same uneven letters, because Hazel had saved a photograph of the original and it seemed important to be accurate. The railroad curved elsewhere. The men with the maps moved on, and in the churchyard at the edge of Clearwater Falls, beneath the spruce trees that had grown tall and dark and unhurried, two stones stood side by side in ground that thawed every spring without being asked to, and kept the names of people who had chosen, against ordinary expectation, to remain.